There's a lot of different arguments for the existence of God, and one of the most famous and misunderstood is the ontological argument. This argument's different than some you might be familiar with, like the teleological argument or the cosmological argument, because instead of starting with an observation about the world and going from that to work backwards to a creator, it just takes the idea of God itself and argues that on the meaning of the word God, there has to be a God. There's a variety of ways that this argument has been made in history. Probably the simplest way goes like this. If it's possible that God exists, God exists. It is possible that God exists, and therefore God exists. Now, that's going to strike a lot of people as a very weird argument, because it seems odd to us to think that just because it's possible that there's a God, there's a God. After all, it's possible that there's unicorns, but that doesn't mean any of us think that there are really such things as unicorns. Well, the way the argument works is by relying on what it means for something to be possible and what it means for something to be necessary. Christians have always thought that if there's a God at all, he's necessarily there, he's the creator, and he created everything else. So everything depends on him. Unlike us, God is not contingent. He had to be the way that he is, and he had to exist. So that first premise in the argument, if it's possible that God exists, is trying to capture those ideas. And it trades on a development in contemporary logic called modal logic. What it means for something to be possible in that system is that there is a consistent, logical way that you could describe the world with this object in it. So some objects are not possible in that way. For example, a square circle. That's not a thing that could exist. Or a married bachelor. That's not a thing that could exist. But you're possible and I'm possible. And what that means is there's a way the world could have been where you and I were there. When with God, what we want to say is it's possible that God is there, and at the same time that God is necessary. So if he's in one of the ways the world could have been, what it means for him to be necessary is he's in every world. Any way the world could have been, there would have been a God. That's what we mean when we say the word God. He's the greatest conceivable thing, and if there were anything better than him, it would be God, not him. So the second premise is if it's possible, it is possible that God exists. And that's the one that most professional philosophers would want to dispute with, even though it doesn't sound like it's giving very much. If God really is necessary, that gets the whole ballgame. Now, this argument is, in a variety of forms, I think, valid, meaning all the premises relate to each other the right sort of way, and sound, meaning all the premises are true. But that doesn't always make it effective because it's kind of difficult to understand, and because very often it will appear to people like a trick. Even though there's sophisticated ways that professional philosophers can make it, it still feels like a trick to most people. And so in my experience, I've really only discussed this argument with non-believers in the context of trying to teach traditional arguments for the philosophy of religion, or in trying to explain what Christians mean when they say God. They don't mean by the word God something like Thor or something like Zeus. They mean something altogether different, something that had to be there if he's there at all. One time I was teaching in secular college in Texas, and I was going through these arguments, the teleological argument, the moral argument, the argument from mathematics, the argument from fine-tuning, the argument from design, the argument by analogy, the argument so on, and including the argument from so many arguments. And in the process of doing that, I went across the ontological argument, and we went through it for an hour or so. And there was a student in the back of class who got real quiet through the course of it, and by the end, he sat out, leaned back, and said aloud, "Oh God, he exists!" And I was really shocked, because I didn't expect for this argument to convince anyone of anything, except for they probably needed to think harder about how to defeat the argument, or they needed to think hard about what the trick was. I didn't think anybody would really be convinced by it. And so I said, "Hey, I need you to talk to me after. There's a few more things I'd want to tell you about God." And after class, I shared the gospel with him, and we had some very good conversations for the rest of the term. So it is the sort of thing that, if people are in the right conceptual frame, could do a lot of good for them. And I think it can give Christians a lot of confidence to know there are very sophisticated ways in our highest levels of modal reasoning, at the highest levels of our philosophical enterprises, to show that there are valid and presumably sound arguments for the existence of God.